This is Harvest Moon Homecoming, Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 1. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 3. Chapter 5. Ellie tensed. Her eyes popped open. Her heart stuttered to a stop, then did a flip and started beating double time. Her chest tingled, and she buried her hands in his hair. Thick, wavy hair. Perfect. Had she kissed a man since Liam died? She hadn't even considered dating with Harper at home. She didn't remember it feeling this good. She pushed closer. His fingers ran down her back. Goosebumps broke out on her skin. She closed her eyes, sliding her hands around his waist, which felt surprisingly hard under her fingertips. He groaned and pulled her closer. His tongue touched her lip, like a flame touching a can of gasoline. Fireworks exploded in her brain, bright red. Heat shot through her body, scorching through her skin. Her fingers clawed his back. Her hand slipped back to his head, gripping and pulling him closer. He pulled her to him. She complied, allowing him to lift her, wrapping her legs around his waist. Totally lost in a passion-draped world that included only Fink and her and the combustive sensations that fused in an intoxicating riot. "Mom?" Startled, she pushed away. He dropped her like forbidden fruit. Her feet tangled together, and her butt hit the floor with a thunk. Fink took 2 steps back. He leaned against the metal wall, his hands behind him, as though somehow proclaiming his innocence. From her position on the dirt floor, she glanced up at Harper, whose brows reached her hairline. Wyatt stood behind her, his jaw agape, blinking slowly as though trying to get the images in front of him to return to normal.
We thought we heard shouting in here."
Harper tilted her head. "Yeah, after what happened earlier, we thought you two might need a referee and a timeout, but
I think they still need a referee and a timeout, just not in the way we thought."
Harper tapped her upper lip. No, they both blurted out. Ellie shot Fink a quelling glance and scrambled to her feet.
"That wasn't what you thought it was. I mean, it wasn't what it looked like."
Fink cleared his throat. "We were looking at pictures and deciding on a design for the float."
"It's not that kind of parade."
Harper wrinkled her nose at Fink. "Of course not. I mean, everything is child-friendly." Ellie couldn't remember Fink ever looking less than professional, but his hair was mussed, his clothing askew, his face flushed. His gaze darted around, looking anywhere but her, and his professional poise had possibly run off with her self-control.
"My mother had her legs wrapped around your waist. I don't think that's appropriate for preschoolers."
"Maybe you guys could just do, like, chairs arranged so that people aren't sitting on each other's laps and stuff? Where I come from, if we do a movie theme or something for school, we don't usually do the love scene, especially in a parade." Wyatt shrugged.
So did you guys come down to help?"
Ellie said, changing the subject, since Fink's uninspired comments hadn't helped. Not that she'd added much. Her heart still hammered and her lips throbbed. She could taste Fink on her tongue. Intriguing, and she hadn't even begun to satisfy her curiosity. But she didn't even like him. Why had he kissed her? Why had she allowed it? And, holy cow, why had she enjoyed it so darn much?
"I have that test to study for, but I think I'd better stay."
Harper started to walk farther into the shed.
No.
Ellie put her hand up. Harper was a great student and got excellent grades. She didn't want anything to jeopardize it.
We're fine.
But she didn't want to be alone with Fink.
Wyatt can stay.
I hadn't gotten a piece of apple pie yet. No matter how desperate she was to not be alone with Fink again, a part of her heart went out to this boy with no parents. She glanced at Fink. His face had softened.
Go ahead and get pie, Wyatt. We'll handle this,
she said. Fink avoided her gaze.
Okay.
Harper gave her a hard stare.
Mom, you do remember how you got me, right? Of course I do. Well, I've always wanted a brother or sister, but I didn't expect you to leap.
She waved her hand, at a loss for words. On to the first principal you see, Wyatt finished for her. Ellie was half horrified, half tempted to laugh. Wyatt might be a senior in high school and over 6 feet, but he was cute as a kindergartner with both front teeth missing. She put her hands on her hips.
I am not taking all the blame for that. Mr. Finkenbinder would never do anything inappropriate. And I would? I'm your mother. How can you say that? Mom.
One side of Harper's mouth curled up in a half smile.
You do have a tendency to be impulsive.
Ellie wanted to defend herself, but she understood what Harper was saying. Although she didn't feel like she deserved it, when one looked at Mr. Never a Wrong Move Finkenbinder versus herself, she was the one most likely to be inappropriate. Swallowing against the tightness in her throat, she said,
Go back to the house. Study for your test. You too, Wyatt. I'm a big girl, and whether I grab the first principal I see or not, I'll face the consequences.
She turned to Fink.
And if you're afraid for your virtue, you can go too. I'll have this done by Saturday morning.
I'll stay. His face held no expression. After one last glance, Harper said,
Come get me if you need me, Mom.
She followed Wyatt out the door. Say something, you coward. But Fink's mouth wouldn't open. He hadn't been able to come forward to defend Mrs. Bright 30 seconds ago, and he couldn't think of anything to say after the door closed behind Harper and Wyatt. He had kissed Mrs. Bright. His fingers itched to reach for her. He shoved his hands in his pockets. The kiss. It had been phenomenal, earth-shaking, all-encompassing. He hadn't wanted it to end. Not ever. What was wrong with him? He couldn't have actually enjoyed kissing Mrs. Bright. Heck yeah, he had. He wanted to do it again. Part of him was disgusted by that thought. Another part wanted more. Maybe wanted to see how far her bad reputation would take her. With him, not far, he'd wager. But all he had to do was remind himself of the superintendent position, the prestige he'd always wanted, the academic jewel. Quite an accomplishment, especially as young as he was. He'd worked too hard, and he needed the vindication. He could and would control himself. Shaking his head, Fink made sure his face showed nothing of his inner turmoil as Mrs. Bright paced beside the wagon.
So, the theme for homecoming is Harvest Moon. We ought to have a big moon, maybe somehow shine a light, and maybe have cardboard cutouts of a boy and a girl that could cast a romantic shadow on the moon.
Mrs. Bright stood with arms akimbo in front of the old wagon. Keeping her eyes on it, she walked along, as though picturing it all in her imagination.
Then, of course, I can provide the usual fall decorations, and since the parade is the National Farmers' Day Parade, we should also have a tribute to farmers, and we should definitely have scaffolding to have the king and queen up off the floor of the wagon where everyone can see them. They could do the shadows on the moon. No, that wouldn't work, because they need to wave and toss candy.
Mrs. Bright continued rattling on. Fine. She was going to ignore the kiss. And the argument. That was fine. He'd keep his mouth shut and help her so they could get this thing done by Saturday. He let her talk and plan. When she started grabbing 2x4s, he helped her carry them. When she picked up the bag of tools, he carried it to the bench for her. For over 3 hours, he carried and sawed, hammered and screwed. Their conversation was minimal. Pass the hammer. Measure 36 inches. He hated working with no plan, but he wasn't going to risk another argument. No, he'd love to have another argument. He couldn't see any rhyme or reason to what she was doing, and he didn't think the base of the structure had the proper support to hold any kind of weight. But he wasn't going to risk another kiss. So he kept his mouth shut. He could hardly put his tongue in her delectable mouth if he had his teeth clamped tight in front of it. She had amazing eyes, plump, beautiful lips, and a sweet mouth, but he wasn't going to fall for any of that. No, sir. He'd build this float and get the heck out. At 1 a.m., she stopped.
I can't believe it's that late,
she said after asking him the time.
I can't believe the kids haven't been back down.
Wyatt texted me 2 hours ago. Said your father-in-law was taking him home.
Oh, Harper probably went to bed then.
It is a school night. He refrained from saying most parents would have insisted their children be in bed long before this.
Well, I wanted to have the frame done so we could finish it up tomorrow. I just want to put one more board up there.
She pointed to a corner. I'm not sure how sturdy it is, Fink said. Mrs. Bright rolled her eyes.
Seriously, Fink, you're such a downer. This thing would give the Brooklyn Bridge a run for its money.
To prove her point, she grabbed a 2x4 and yanked back and forth on it. The wagon rocked forward and the structure swayed. She let it go, but it was too late. Watch out! Mr. Finkenbinder grabbed Mrs. Bright and dove into the far corner of the barn as the structure he'd spent the last 5 hours building came crashing down. Chapter 6. Dust flew. The wagon lurched. Mr. Finkenbinder didn't look back, but kept Mrs. Bright covered in case a stray board fell this way. The crashing and bumping stopped, and quietness filled the shed. Mrs. Bright, stretched out under him, seemed to slump into the floor after she peeked over his shoulder at the mess scattered around the wagon. She closed her eyes and laid her head back.
This must be where I say you were right,
she whispered. Something stirred in his chest. He'd seen her hassled. He'd seen her harried, angry, defiant, smug, tired, determined. But he'd never seen her defeated. Hey! He grabbed her chin and gave it a shake. When she opened her eyes, he put his face in front of hers. We'll get this. Now we know what doesn't work. She snorted.
No, it's hopeless. This was too big of a project for us.
She looked away, and he nudged her chin again, but she ignored him.
There's a bunch of mangled up 2x4s beside us, and it's all my fault. You can say it. I know you're dying to.
She bit her lip. I'm dying to say... He was dying to say she had spectacular blue eyes, kissable lips, a mouth sweeter than any he had ever imagined. "I'm dying to say I loved your idea of the big full moon with silhouettes on it, and we can do it." He focused on her forehead. "But not tonight. Right now, we're going to take that thing apart, salvage what we can of the boards, and then call it a night." She sighed and shut her eyes. Her body moved slightly under his. He closed his eyes. When had Ellie, Mrs. Bright, become a temptation? Ellie had planned to be on time Tuesday morning. She really had. But school had been in session for at least a half an hour before her truck careened around the turn and into the parking lot. Drat Bubba down at Dick's garage. He'd charged her full price for a brake job that only worked half the time. Or possibly the old jalopy's brake lines had sprung another leak. Whatever. She definitely needed Bubba to bump her next appointment to the top of the waiting list so she wouldn't have to park on the sidewalk where it dipped and cracked in order to keep her truck from rolling and hitting anyone since the emergency brake didn't work either. She hadn't had time to ream him out about it, since it had been almost 3 this morning before she and Fink had gotten everything taken apart. They'd have been done a heck of a lot sooner, except Fink had insisted on stacking everything neatly, putting the reusable nails and screws back in the bin and throwing the rest away. More than once, she'd picked up a board, at his command, and carried it to its proper pile while repressing the urge to remove his internal organs and line them up into neat little rows too. But that was then, and at least she'd learned this about herself. Even when provoked, with easy access to sharp tools, she was unlikely to commit cold-blooded murder. Much as she desperately wanted to kill him, not kiss him, of course. Because after she'd gone to bed, she'd felt his kiss when she had closed her eyes, and his surprisingly hard abs, soft lips, and gentle hands. It had been hard to roll out of bed this morning. As she ripped into the parking lot, she spotted a man getting out of his 4-door sedan, a sleek, expensive-looking model. A boy, looking a lot like Wyatt, got out of the passenger side. The man, briefcase in hand, wearing dress shirt and tie, but no suit coat, power-walked toward the sidewalk. The boy ran.
"Mom!"
Harper's voice shook from the wrenching of the pickup.
"That's Mr. F. and Wyatt." "Fink is late?"
She did a double take.
"Fink isn't wearing a suit coat?"
What was the world coming to? She'd never seen that man at school in less than a full-out suit, buttoned up to his chin.
"Looks like it." "Later than us?"
Ellie couldn't believe it. She hopped out of the truck and rushed around the front, her boots clomping. Fink reached the door just before her. He yanked it open, then stood, holding it for Harper, then her.
"Good morning, Fink,"
Ellie said as she swished past him, pleased she'd taken the time to throw on jeans and a flannel shirt. Her hair? Well, she'd work on that tomorrow. "Good morning, Ellie, Mrs. Bright, Harper." Wyatt had gone ahead of his uncle, and now held the second of the pair of doors. Ellie greeted him as she swept past. She pulled the blank paper out of her pocket.
"Do you have a pen, Harper?" "Just a pen?"
Ellie looked back, waving the paper.
"Wow, Mom, you're organized this morning."
Harper placed a pen in Ellie's outstretched hand. Ellie looked back, intending to smile at her daughter, but Fink's gaze captured hers. He didn't yell at her for being late. Rather, he smiled. And, drat her crazy heart, it flipped like a performer on a trapeze. That was when she noticed something else about Fink. He had straight, white teeth. Darn it to the pea patch and back, She was a sucker for good teeth. Mr. Finkenbinder walked into the shop at 7:45. He'd wanted to start earlier so he wasn't late for school again, but Mrs. Bright couldn't leave until closing time, which turned out well since he was able to meet with Jordan to help with his trig homework. Mrs. Bright stood beside the wagon, staring at it with her head tilted. She glanced at him and waved when he walked in. "Good evening, Mrs. Bright." They were not going to fight tonight if he could help it. She looked back at the wagon and crossed her arms over her chest.
"We tried it my way yesterday, and that didn't work. So tonight I figured we'd do it your way. Only I was hoping we could use the wagon and tractor rather than a pickup."
Huh. She glanced his way again.
"Is Wyatt with you?"
"He's at your house and coming down when Harper's pies come out of the oven." Mrs. Bright snorted.
"Well, I think we'll really need them tonight. I have everything we need to decorate this in a traditional way, but most of it is still out in the field. We didn't carry in anything we didn't need for the shop. Thankfully, there hasn't been a hard frost yet this year, so all we have to do is go get it. Except for the hay bales. They're in the barn."
Fink walked to where she stood. Did she stiffen beside him? Was she afraid he was going to grab her and kiss her again? Maybe he should apologize. But he couldn't. He wasn't sorry. Holding up his briefcase, he said, "I brought a couple of pictures." Her brows furrowed.
"Huh?"
After brushing off the back of the wagon, he set his briefcase down. The clasps clicked as he opened them and pulled out some papers. The finished design was on top. He held it up. "This is the closest I could come to what you described last night." Ellie gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand and leaned closer to the paper. Her eyes lit up. They searched the page, looking for flaws probably.
"It's perfect," she said. "Exactly what I was talking about."
Fink allowed himself a small smile. A thrill shot down his spine. Victory. No, actually, the look on Ellie's face was what caused his thrill. Half wonder, half admiration. It made him want to do something to cause that look again. To have those amazing blue eyes settle warmly upon him. And, heaven help him, this morning she'd worn jeans to school rather than her normal sleepwear. Hot dog with anchovies. Ellie had a nice, well-rounded little tush. Very nice. He swallowed. Focus.
"But I don't want to do it."
"What?" he asked. "Why?"
"It's too much. You were right yesterday. I wanted to do something nice, something better than anyone else, the best float ever. But you can't start at the last minute, whacking together something slipshod, and expect it to turn out. You need a plan. And you need enough time to accomplish it."
Her lips turned down, and she looked at the wagon where her framework had disintegrated.
"This needs to be done by Saturday. I think we could spend the time and do something a little nicer, but this is important to you, so let's get it done."
She was giving up the design she wanted for his peace of mind? He laid the paper back down inside his briefcase and cleared his throat. "Thank you." He paused. "I did think that since you were helping, if you want to put a banner or some kind of advertisement for the farm on the float or tractor, that would be fine." Her brows shot up.
"Wow, if it won't ruin the look of the float, I might do that. I've been trying to increase business enough to make it financially feasible to hire someone to help, so I can spend more time making decorations. I certainly won't turn down a little free advertising for the farm."
"Well, it is the school float, and we can't do anything big or gaudy."
I know that,
she snapped. Of course you do, he snapped back, just like you know what time to get up in the morning.
Are you incapable of allowing the past to rest?
That was today. He was actually tempted to roll his eyes.
You were late too.
You rubbed off on me.
Stop acting like I'm stupid.
She crossed her arms and stomped her foot. I can hear you just fine. You don't need to screech. I was only saying I wanted to make sure the school comes first. He tried to keep his voice under control.
I wasn't trying to overshadow the school.
She stepped toward him. Just making sure. He didn't back down. They stood toe to toe.
If you didn't want me to put the farm name on the float, why did you offer it?
Why do you always get upset with everything I say? She rolled her eyes.
I don't. You're the one who got upset first.
It was you. I want the farm on it. He planted his feet. He would not back away from her. Drat this stubborn woman.
You're not acting like it.
I wouldn't have offered if I didn't. His neck was hot, and he couldn't keep his voice from matching her volume, exceeding it.
Just forget about it. Keep the farm out of it.
I said the farm could go on. He enunciated each word clearly and loudly.
You didn't mean it,
she shouted. Bright red spots lit both her cheeks. I meant it, he shouted back. They stood with their faces inches apart, panting. Her breath was hot, but sweet on his lips. Her eyes shone. She was, quite possibly, the most alive woman he'd ever met. Or maybe she just made him feel alive. Because he did. His heart was thumping, his entire body tingled, and although irritation bunched in his chest, something else, something bigger than his body could contain, made him want to float up or expand, like joy that bubbled in his soul. Only he was face to face, toe to toe, and shouting at the woman in front of him. He should be angry, and maybe he was a little, but that wasn't the emotion driving him right now. His eyes widened. He knew what it was. Passion. Which was why he shouldn't have been surprised when Ellie stood on tiptoe, leaned in, grabbed his neck, and covered his mouth with hers. Shouldn't have been, but was. But his body wasn't. His arms swathed around her, pulling her close. He pressed into her, her back against the hay wagon, her hands shoved in his hair, her lips moving under his. His hand touched the smooth, warm material on her back, traced the curve of her spine. She shivered, and bright orange lights exploded behind his closed eyelids. A little moan escaped her lips, and she pulled him even closer. She was so sweet, so alive in his arms. The hand on her back slid up, fitting to the side of her rib cage, moving up. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.